Hi, I'm Chris Blake. I'm one of the founding directors of an organisation called the Green Valleys, which is a social enterprise working in Wales. And we've been working for about 10 years to help communities with impacts of climate change, reducing climate emissions, and working to do community regeneration. The project which I've spent the last 2 to 3 years working on is Project Skyline, and that builds on some of the work we did originally on community woodland management, but taking it to a much bigger scale, learning from some of the Scottish experience of landscape scale community woodland forest management and applying that and seeing whether we can apply that to the coal mining valleys of the South Wales, where the forest is there, the coal mines are gone, the forest is there, but there's absolutely no connection between the communities, thousands of people, and the landscape that's on their doorstep. It's managed out of area, the proceeds go out of area. There's no connection. The decisions about that landscape are made out of area. Can we bring that back into the community, and can we regenerate a sense of place and belonging in some of those communities?
So we had a politician down last week, and she's fantastically supportive. But I'd say the key thing that came from her time with us was disbelief that we actually deliver what we say we're going to do.
Yes.
And I think there's a real risk aversion, like you say, and a real risk adverse culture where people don't want to be on the front of that newspaper as the person that got it wrong. I think we've got very little tolerance to make mistakes and to accept mistakes are natural and that we need to actually celebrate them.
Yeah.
That is a big culture shift. But I also think there is some responsibility to help people go on that journey with us and to hold their hand and to show them it's possible incrementally. And that the challenge is how you do that with the time pressure of the change we all know we need to see happening to prevent biodiversity collapse and other environmental issues we're fully aware of. But I do think sometimes we need to hold hands and to bring people with us so that they can see and believe, because, humans being as they are, they need to see it to believe it. And if they can't see it and they can't feel it, then they struggle to engage with it, which is why I think it's so important to be in spaces like this so that people see it's possible. And then they go, right, well, if you can do it like that, then what happens next?
Well, and then you're seeing and believing is right. So one of the most important things when we were doing this feasibility work for the Skyline project, we took from the 3 communities in the valleys, we took them up to Scotland, where there have been community land projects running for 20, 25 years. And I think before we went up to Scotland, there was a benevolent kind of, well, what's Chris talking about? I don't really get it, but it sounds interesting. Let's keep talking to him. Then we went up to Scotland 2 years ago, October 2018, and on the way back, it was just the transformation was, oh my God, now I've seen it. If those guys can do that, then we can do it. There's actually the complete sense of belief, that the empowerment to be able to do it by having seen it work. I could talk in theory and practice, all the theoretical stuff you like, but actually to see it and then go, right, now I understand. And it's made a huge difference. And I think it will be a very significant difference in the future. So you've got something that's concrete and real, and you're building more houses, and that will then people's belief, they don't have to trust that you're right, they can see that you're right.
Yeah, exactly.
And once we've got the Rhondda Skyline project up and working in Drurba, I think there'll be a path will be beaten to its door from every valley. They'll all be coming to look. So what have you done? How did you do it? If you guys can do that, we can certainly do it. And it's that sense of belief, which has been squeezed out, I think, a lot. Absolutely. Because that what we were talking about earlier, that sense of agency, that empowerment to actually make a change. The system is so not through design. It's just the way it's worked. Somebody else in a corporation, private or state, makes the decisions that affect our lives, and you don't worry yourselves. Just sit and watch telly, go into your house, fine. But actually, to change that and to give a sense of agency to a community is a really, really powerful thing. But you have to trust. They've got to be trusted. It's to be trust, and the trust has, in many cases, disappeared.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you see that with the expectation that you have with people to recover from an injury, or recover from a challenging experience at school, just the expectation is their life pathway is set.
Yes.
But actually, it doesn't take the greatest amount of intervention for people to have hope and to see there are possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, so the communities we've been working in, the post-industrial communities of the South Wales valleys, these are, they are defined recently. I mean, you go back in history, they weren't, but for the last 150 years, they've been coal mining. They've been coal mining and heavy industry towns, and now they're post-industrial and that is the definition of the town. That's in everybody's self-awareness and belief. And one of the images that I quite like, I borrowed it. It's come from another organisation, Wood Knowledge Wales. We try and make forest towns. These are not ex-mining towns, they're future forest towns. We're giving a new narrative, a new story where the town, not everyone in the town, but a lot of the town can have a connection with its landscape, can create jobs, can create building materials, can grow food, can create energy. And it's a new definition of what that community's relationship with the landscape is, not a negative one of post-industrial used to be. Now it's providing a new image, a new vision,
which is future oriented and hope based, which is critical if people are going to commit and move forwards. Because if they can't see hope, and they can't see how the future could be better, then why would anyone engage with anything? So I think that's sounds amazing. It's interesting to think about how to engage people in a process where they don't necessarily see the direct impact or benefit for themselves. Because what we found is, the assumption would be, well, why would someone help you build houses? Why would someone help build that building over there for you, or manage that woodland over there for you, or help grow those vegetables over there? Why would they do that if it's not for themselves and not for direct benefit for themselves? But what we've actually found is, once people are part of a cycle where they're in a space which has been built by others before them, and they are in a space which immediately tells them, I can do this because someone has already done it, who's from a similar background. So imagine going to a building that's been built by someone, say, who's had a brain injury, and you are at the early stage of recovery from a brain injury. You're immediately going, wow, this is possible. I could do this. So then people enter a sort of cycle where actually the reason for engagement isn't an immediate personal benefit. They realise they're benefiting from others, and what their actions are will benefit the people that come after them.
Yeah.
And then you get a very different transaction or reason for why people want to do something.
Yeah. I can relate that to the Skyline project and also what we saw in Scotland, because the community, people have different dreams and different visions, and they're completely different from somewhere where it's a nice place to walk the dog to what we saw in Scotland, which I think has really inspired some people in the Rhondda, the forest crofts, where you're given 4 hectares of forest land, and you're allowed to manage that land and build your house yourself on that land and live there and grow things there. And there are certain restrictions. You have to maintain a degree of forest cover. There are certain things you can't bring. You're going to use natural materials. It's sort of one planet development principles. Yeah. But under the Scottish crofting law, which is really interesting, you can then pass that on to anyone you choose, whether it's your children, a friend, anybody else, with the same restrictions forever, so that your investment in that land is not wasted. It can't be taken away by the landlord. And now that's a very deep involvement in landscape. That is living in every sense within the landscape. But there are other people for whom just having a safe place for the kids to play, or a place to walk the dog, or some other... So the interactions and relationships with landscape can be very, very different, and depending on the needs and the dreams and the visions of the individuals, they don't have to be the same. It's not a single solution that landscape stewardship can offer. It's an ability for people to use that asset to fulfil whatever their vision is, and it'll start small, but it might end up in a really profound way.
But again, like you said earlier, it's very trust-based, isn't it? There's a framework, but inherently the people are trusted to do something good with that.
And one of the early criticisms we got of the idea, the Skyline idea, was, well, yeah, that's all very well, but I know these people, and they'll just want to cut down all the trees and get as much cash as they can and build and spend it on something, a swimming pool.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I don't think that's right. And we did a lot of engagement with the community. We did a lot of using arts-based materials, using poetry, using art, using kids and storytelling to engage the heart before you engage the brain. So you don't come into a sort of a strict workshop and say, right, how would you like this valley to look like in 100 years' time? Here's a sticky note, put it on the map. It's starting with remembering what's been lost, remembering the past, going back in a timeline to a pre-industrial period and realising that there's been a relationship between subsistence of the community and the landscape for hundreds of years. And so when we asked people through these engagement processes, well, what future do you envisage? They immediately balanced all of the goals. It was like they were working for the Future Generation Commissioner's Office. They just, we want some jobs, we want some income, we want livelihoods, we want a better place for nature, we want a place to play, we want all of these multiple benefits. But of course we do, because it's where we live. Sure. Maximising it for one financial gain is not our objective. That's, and it was just instinctive. There hadn't been a workshop on the Wellbeing Act beforehand. It was just, of course, you need to trust. And I suppose this is my biggest thing I've learned is that you can, and you should, you have to trust the people who live in a place to make the best balanced judgments about its use, and that is trust, and not an agency who is scripted to maximise income or a particular wood fibre output. And they do that very well within their remit. That's what they do. Whereas you can trust a community to make the nuanced and balanced judgments about how a landscape is used. And that strikes me as very similar to what you were saying about the person who's going to live in a house makes a different judgment about how that house should be designed and how it should be built and what it should feel like, compared with and I'm going to be maybe harsh here, a director of a corporate building firm who sees it as a unit to maximise profit.
Absolutely.
And that's a very different.
Yeah,
it's a very different world.
It's not a unit.
Yes.
And I think that language is very different, isn't it?
So I think one of the things that we're both talking about actually is a set of values. Sometimes what I think we're about is it's a form of deglobalisation. I'm going to use a fancy word here, but the globalisation of assets and businesses is that we can make more profit if we do this thing: grow food, harvest timber somewhere else, build houses. We'll globalise it. We'll be very efficient. We'll have very large corporations, and the unit cost of these elements is lower, and therefore there's more value and more surplus, and everyone can be wealthier. And that has given us disastrous consequences: economic, social, environmental consequences. And some of the deglobalisation is about recognising that the values, it isn't just about the cash. It's about the multiple human values that are in a place. Connection with place, connection with a house, connection with a landscape, connection with a building, how you relate to that socially, artistically, culturally, that it's your place that you generate energy from, it's the place you generate. It may not be the cheapest food you can buy on the planet, but it's food that your community has grown, that you've got a connection with, that maybe you volunteered to create, to produce. And that recognition of the multiple values, it is coming because social value calculations are starting to feature in Welsh Government thinking. They fall straight out of the Wellbeing Act.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, no, you're right. And I think it's shifting away from this sort of monocultural way of thinking, which we have, monocultures in farming are well understood to be higher in notional yields and one metric, but devastating topsoil, heavy input of synthetic materials, much wider pollutional impact, but they produce a crop at scale. Shift into a sort of polycultural, multiple sort of inputs, multiple outputs, a very diverse way of working. We're shifting to that model. That's what Skyline are doing. That's what Down to Earth is doing. But it's much more complex, and it requires quite a radical shift in thinking away from the sort of do one thing well sort of headspace to how do we recognise that everything is interwoven and we hold that complexity and we work with it and we communicate it, because nothing operates in isolation, whether that's in a natural ecosystem or wider cultural, societal or economic ecosystem. We're all interlinking, and there's constant tugging and shifting. As one thing moves, it impacts another. So how do we embrace that, and how do we recognise, particularly in a financial sense, that value? And
well, because the appeal of financial calculations is that they're can be audited, they're definitive. Whereas so many of the things we're talking about are not easily quantifiable. There's a complex interrelationship. So of course the governance model. One of the difficulties we've been encountering with the Skyline project is that and it's so embedded, this sense that the forest is of its primary purpose as financial value, and that if we give a single community access to the right to this forest, everyone else in Wales is losing out, because they're not getting the cash that is generated for the state by that forest. But that's not reflecting the value that's created, the social relationship, the confidence, the civic engagement. One of the best pieces of research that's been done on the Scottish land movement is that the huge increase in civic engagement that happens in communities that own their own landscape. So voting goes up, volunteering goes up, engagement with other organisations. It's just, you can measure it. And if a community has ownership or stewardship of their land, then everyone is more engaged in civic society. Difficult to measure. You can't put a cash benefit on that, but it sounds like a pretty good thing.
And how long do you think that takes? I mean, what's the Scottish experience?
I don't know. Well, they've been running that experiment for 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
I don't know how quickly that kicks in. But you get the early adopters, the enthusiasts who are probably very keen at the start. We went up to Kilfinnan in Argyll. We took the community up and we stayed with the Kilfinnan Community Forest Group, and we met them in the pub. And they'd been running 9 years when we were there. And we asked them about the attitude of the wider community to the project, to the forest project. And they'd taken them 8 or 9 years to get, for most people, a passive acceptance and an approval of what they were doing. Those are people who are not actively engaged. They weren't volunteering in the woods. They weren't working in the sawmill. They weren't working in the gardens. No, they weren't forest crofters. But it's taken quite a few years for them to be no, I'm proud. I'm pleased this has happened. Even though I'm not actively involved, I can now see, and that's it's maybe the best part of a decade.
I was going to say, so I guess a decade-long commitment as a minimum to let something find its feet and to see whether it's starting to have the impact. Which is a very different shift from our current sort of level of investment in the type of work that both our organisations do, which is on a very typical 3-year funding cycle.
3-year. I was going to mention 3-year funding cycles, 4 or 5-year political cycles. That's a really difficult. And that's where that risk comes in, isn't it? So the civil servant or the politician has got to make a commitment to enable something to happen, the benefits of which may not be seen for a decade or two. That's a big shift.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to learn, isn't there, from other countries where there's like a 25-year investment cycle or vision, which you might see, say, in Germany or Switzerland.
Yes.
Which seems quite similar to what you're describing in Scotland. I mean, it's just a different sort of ambition and a vision which goes beyond those typical political cycles which often hold back progress.
Yes, yeah. So one of the projects we're hoping to do in around Trevor is going to use the timber from the forest to actually build social housing units.
Great.
And we want you and your experience of Down to Earth to help us with that process.
Great, which is amazing because we're piloting it right now, so we can see from the 6 that we're doing at the moment that it's possible. I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, often it takes people to be able to see it, to believe it. So all you'll need to do, I say all, and it's, you've got to bring people out, see it's possible.
Yeah.
Go and see these 6 houses. They're made of Welsh timber. We're doing roof trusses with Douglas, which has just never been done in recent memory. And we're going to be able to show that people who are ordinarily not given that opportunity, whether they're asylum seekers and refugees, young people who are not engaging in education or employment, adults who've had a whole load of healthcare issues, all those people can together build fantastic houses at a quality level, which is outstanding. I mean, I go out there regularly and I'm blown away by the quality of the buildings that are getting done. And these are houses that are for social rent.
Yes.
So these are houses for people who would ordinarily be given what, recent housing ministers in Wales have called slums of the future.
Yeah.
So we want to change those. Why wouldn't we want to build houses that we'd all want to live in and be proud of living in? So that way of building can absolutely be translated over to Skyline.
And it's all going to start because we're going to have to walk through the forest with a forester and work out what species is that? Is that going to be any good? Can we use that? Because we want to, the point is to use the resources that are around the town, not import it from Finland or Canada or wherever. One of the things we saw in Scotland was a fantastic social housing unit. It cost about £40,000 for them to build. It was a 3-bedroom family house built from timber, which was not structurally graded at all. It was basically they designed a version of a log house with sawn logs, so they didn't have to have the structural strength which the spruce thing. And the timber had come from no more than 2 kilometres from the location of the 6 houses. It was, this tree grew there and is now where I live.
That's it.
It's a fantastic connection.
Yeah, and then people see, what would have maybe for others just looked at a monocultural forest and not seen any value in it.
Yeah.
You can translate that into, if that can turn into an asset, that kind of long-term benefit for the community.
Yeah, which unlocks up the carbon rather than putting it into biomass or something. That house is going to be around for 100 years or longer.
Yeah.
The carbon in that will be locked up for the longest possible time.
Yeah, indeed.